Welcome to the Chimera, a role-playing adventure podcast. This week, I'm afraid I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that due to a scheduling kerfuffle, we had to miss a recording session, and thus we do not have a proper episode this week. The good news is that we wrangled the remainder of the cast to have a discussion about our plans for Season 2. So get ready for some in-depth system chat, some character discussion, and a whole lot of Greyhawk lore. More Greyhawk lore than, frankly, I thought there was. As always, I am Vin LeBate, and I'll be playing Golden-Eyed Rakashi, the Dragonborn Rogue. Joining me this week are Jeffrey Bard as Sarsemian, the Human Sword Mage, Kacey Smith as Latchkey, the Shardmind Scion/Battlemind, Josh Hall-Bachner as a yet unnamed Warforged Sorcerer. Josh will join us about halfway through. And our soon-to-be Dungeon Master, Kelly Wiseman-Asquith-Jackson. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, so here we are, having an exciting episode 0 with a partial cast for the next season of the Chimera. I have to remember to say the Chimera and not to say the Chimera, because I grew up reading things and not saying words out loud.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in this upcoming season, we are going to be shifting game systems and settings to a very modified version of Dungeons & Dragons and a fairly modified version of the Greyhawk campaign setting. The Greyhawk campaign setting is, in many ways, the D&D setting, or at least the most D&D setting of any D&D setting that is ever D&D settinged.
The default setting that no one uses.
Yes. At least the default setting for, well, certainly for 3rd edition, sort of for some of 2nd edition. 4th edition, the default settings moved to Forgotten Realms, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I remember anyways.
But before it was Forgotten Realms, it was Greyhawk, and that's for good reason. Greyhawk is, I think, unassailably the most intentionally generic of the various D&D options. If you want fantasy sword and sorcery, you've got several different options. You can go in a very dragon-heavy direction with Dragonlance. You can go in a very high fantasy, intentionally... well, I wouldn't say intentionally Tolkien-esque, because Tolkien actually wasn't really high fantasy in the same way. But if you want a Tolkien, well, you can go play with Elminster in Forgotten Realms. If you want to go branch out from European-style sword and sorcery, you've got a bunch of different options with Al-Qadim and Dark Sun and Planescape. But if you want the most sort of what it says on the tin, European-style sword and sorcery sort of thing, then you go to Greyhawk. And that's partially because Greyhawk is actually built out of the homebrewed campaign settings that were originally run by Gary Gygax and then several of his other friends. The world actually got built out by gluing together their different campaign settings into one semi-coherent, not really that coherent place. That's part of why there's so much repetition in the campaign settings. So there was originally Gygax's campaign setting, which sort of takes up the center and immediate east of the default campaign map. And then there's a different campaign that was what's now the west of the campaign map, another one that was the north of the campaign map, and a fourth that was the northeast of the campaign map. And not only that, but if you dig really deep into the lore, you can find out that there's an entire so long running, I'm not even sure if it's done yet, but like I'm talking about more than a decade's worth of comics in French comics, French sword and sorcery comics that I'm told are actually fairly successful in France. That campaign setting, it's a story setting, right? It's a comic book world. The guy who wrote it was friendly with Gygax and got permission to, and apparently it was originally based on some sort of a D&D game that he ran at some point in the past, I've been told. So he got permission or they got permission from him, it's not totally clear to me, to officially set that way over on the opposite side of the supercontinent. Like, basically, if you picture the default setting of Greyhawk is a region called the Flaneus, which is roughly equivalent in size and to some degree shape to Europe, all the way over at the other end of the continent where you would expect China to be, there's a whole nother Europe. Because there's some other guy's campaign setting from this French comic book that's over there on the other side of Auric, the other side of the supercontinent.
I have never heard of that, and that is fascinating.
Yeah, it's the lore on Greyhawk is actually, I think, really deep and lush and interesting. And that's why we're going to be using it with a modified version of it, of course, for this game. So for anyone listening at home, you're going to be excited about this, whether you don't know anything about Greyhawk or know everything about Greyhawk, because it's both going to make use of a lot of stuff you don't know about. If you're really have never heard of this before, you're not interested in Greyhawk's campaign setting, get ready to get interested in minutia. And then if you are really bought into the minutia, well, great, because I've already modified a whole bunch of stuff. So there's opportunities for everybody to be angry with me. It's very exciting. in true D&D fashion, everybody has something to be hacked off about. So essentially, how I'll describe this setting is that it's using the official Greyhawk timeline. And the events thereof, and uses the official Greyhawk map. And in fact, we're going to hew rather closely to that. Well, everything that's on the map, I can send. I think I've already sent you folks in the Slack copies of it, but it's all very Googleable. An official Greyhawk map that's very easy for you to come by. We're gonna follow that very closely. I don't have to make any emendations to it or tell you to cross out this thing or ignore that thing. Everything is on it. The biggest changes, and these are big changes, is that we're going to be using a very heavily modified version of the 4th edition rules. And 4th edition has a default set of deities and a default cosmology that does not conform to what's in the Greyhawk setting. And while I think Greyhawk is a lot of fun, and obviously I chose it for this setting for a reason, the Greyhawk deities and religious systems in general are complete garbage as far as I'm concerned. That's not unusual. I don't think very highly of any of the D&D pantheons and the religious systems described in pretty much any D&D setting, with maybe the exception of Dark Sun, which, those of you who aren't already snickering, Dark Sun doesn't have any gods in it, so that's a joke.
I actually think a lot of the religious stuff in Eberron is pretty cool.
You know, actually, that would be the second thing I would say. There are actually some very good religious ideas in Eberron that I was actually close to stealing. I was like, oh, there's some good ideas here, but I didn't.
But instead of doing that, you just wrote your own pantheon.
Well, now, so here's what I did. There's a default pantheon in 4th edition, and I have again hewed very closely to that. All of the default deities in the 4th edition pantheon are represented here. I had to seriously rewrite some of them because some of them, again, are garbage, but I did at least retain their names, and for the most part, very most basic descriptions. But there's an idea in 4th edition that all of the deities in the core cosmology have these things called exarchs, which are basically something somewhere between like angels and it's like angels in like a monotheistic Judaism, Christianity, Islam kind of way, or also maybe avatars in more Hindu kind of way. They're somewhere in between those, or maybe they're both at once. Anyways, basically it means that every member of the pantheon has this whole sub-pantheon, which means you've got this nice big field of different divine figures to play with. And that's enough to cover the complexity and variety of religions that needed to be present in order to sort of fix the holes in the Greyhawk setting.
To the degree that they had a beer goddess ready for us when we needed one.
Yes. When Braden decided he wanted to have a beer goddess, like, oh, we can do that. That's not that hard to figure out. So the things I want you to know and take away are there are a very finite set of gods. They're all the gods everywhere. Greyhawk suffers from the problem of being like, well, in this country, these are the gods of this thing, and this thing. And in this other country, these are the gods of this thing, this thing, this thing. Which is the way that it works, in the real world, obviously, but also in the real world.
Right.
Those gods don't really exist. So the fact that there's a conflict doesn't really matter. Whereas here, it's like, well, the religion in this country says that this person created the universe, and then the religion 4 miles that way says that this other person created the universe, and both of these things are supposed to be true because both of them like can appear to their followers and give cleric spells and all of that. Somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong in that dynamic. So my solution is that there are 11 good deities, good or neutral deities in the core pantheon, and they're the real gods, and they have a history, and there's there is a story for how the universe was created that is an accurate story, and they have a whole bunch of different sub people. Exarchs is the term for them. And so different of the religions are interested in different of the gods and different of their exarchs. And so you can actually have two people who follow the same deity but have completely different religions. You can also have two people that follow the same religion but are actually following completely different deities.
Now, do all of the different nations and peoples call all the deities by the same name, or are there some that follow the same deity but they might not recognize that they're actually following the same deity?
That's a good question, and the answer is it will depend a little bit on where we're talking about. So it's probably a good idea to get into the very, very, very basic geography. Like I said, it's completely Googleable if you want to see a map of the Flanneus or a Greyhawk map. Both of those search terms should get you a pretty decent one. But essentially, the Flanneus is this region that looks at least a little bit like Europe, but image reversed, so that what's east is west and what's west is east. But there's an ocean over on the eastern side, and on the western side it trails off into further continent that is not the section we're dealing with. It happens that there's a big freshwater lake in the middle of this, which is different from actual Europe, but that's probably the biggest single departure. So the Flanneus has two major areas. The one area is the area of what's called the Great Kingdom, or Éardi. Éardi is the old name for the Great Kingdom, which is sort of like that. Basically, there was this empire that was as vast as the Roman Empire in the real world, and it used to be in control of much of the continent, and it's really scaled back. So the time we're starting the timeline, it's in sharp decline and has actually lost a lot of territory and broken apart into two warring kingdoms. So there's the region of Éardi. There's kind of a central region around the Great Lake. There's so Éardi is in the east. The central region is in the center. In the west, there's an area called the Sheldamar Valley, which used to be dominated by the Kingdom of Keoland, but the Kingdom of Keoland has also been in decline. And then there's a couple of different barbarian areas to the north and the northeast, and that's the general region of the Flanneus. And the dominant religion for most of the Flanneus, especially the Great Kingdom and the areas that it used to be under control, the whole central region around the Great Lake, which is called the Neardiv. Another note to people who may be listening who are really into Greyhawk stuff: you're going to have to suffer through all of my pronunciations. I have not gone out and made sure to be following all the Gygaxian pronunciations, because I don't even trust that man to pronounce his own name, let alone anything else.
Is that actually documented anywhere?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was wondering, is the Gygaxian pronunciation documented anywhere?
I am not a deep scholar of Greyhawk. These people do exist, and I respect them. As I respect anyone who's done their research on any subject. I have been told by people who are better read on this than I am that there are some official pronunciation notes on some of the weirder things. Like I say "orth," but I've heard different attributions. The same Gygax said, "Say it this way" for this thing and that thing. But you just get, since I'm in charge, you get my pronunciation. That's the way that it works.
Gotcha.
This is not a linguistic democracy. So, anyways, there's a dominant religion for most of the Flaneus, for the Great Kingdom and the region of the central area around the Near-Div, and that's called the following of Rao. And Rao is a incarnation of one of the major gods of the pantheon, Bahamut. And so there's a religion that's based around this incident where Bahamut came to Earth in a mortal form, and it's not exclusively people who follow Bahamut that are members of this religion. There are several other deities whose exarchs were involved in the story of Rao, this character Rao. But for the most part, you can think of it as a very, very, very loose equivalence to Christianity, right? It's about there's a singular figure. It's structured as a church. There's a whole structure of priestly hierarchy above that. There's a large corpus of religious texts, etc., etc. One of the members of this party is going to be a member of the Raoist clergy. Braden's character is a cleric who follows not Rao, but one of the other deities that's involved in the Raoist church. But that's sort of the main, like, if there's a major single religion in the Flaneus, that's the dominant one. The next largest religion in the area of the Flaneus that's probably worth just being aware of is called either the Old Faith or the Faith of Five Wheels, and is basically, again, these are very loose equations, but it's basically a sort of organized paganism of the like Celtic model. So several different deities, none of whom is really necessarily at the top. They sort of move together in a cycle of the seasons. But that's the dominant religion in the Sheldamar Valley. So there's sort of like, basically think of it as, okay, there's like sort of a loose equivalence Christianity, loose equivalence paganism. And then past the edge of the Flaneus, off into a region that roughly equates to the Arabian cultural sphere, there is a third religion called the Way of Al-Akbar, that church is organized very directly as followers of the god Pelor. Pelor is the sun god. So they're not quite monotheistic because they acknowledge the idea that other gods do exist, but they're very strict about only accepting the worship of their god within their tradition. So they're a single god.
Which is essentially like the very old definition of monotheistic, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a different term I'm trying to draw up. Where you acknowledge that other gods exist, but you only follow one. That it's separate from the term monotheism, and I'm blanking on it for the moment. But yes, yeah, a lot of, I mean, proto-Judaism, we say, okay, initially the first followers of what would become Judaism acknowledged the idea that there were other gods, but they only followed one god.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I remember there being stories basically about how, like, your God didn't do that thing, but our God did. So ours is better.
Sure. Yeah. That's a time-honored tradition. And again, this is a large planet with a lot of different regions. So there are other areas to be from. I don't know that it's deeply relevant to any of the characters that we have on the board right now, although Josh is yet to make his characters. So
we're all in crazy anticipation of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
There might be something else happening there. But rest assured, there are ample other religious possibilities, some of which are tied to the same deities. I think the ones I mentioned so far are Bahamut, who's the sort of god of truth and justice and loyalty, and Pelor, who's the god of sun and time and fire. But there are other ones that are more focused on things like Arathis, the god of civilization and invention and mechanics.
That sounds like Molly would follow.
Yes, right. Definitely. So that was a little bit of a geographic rundown, a little bit of a cultural, religious rundown. Let's talk about characters. I think it would be good if you could start, Vin, if you're all right, just giving a little introduction about your character and what she's about.
Yeah. It's probably worth noting that we are using the full complement of later edition species for our characters. Mm-hmm. So some of these will not be particularly familiar to the more old school Greyhawk. And I'm playing a Dragonborn. Yeah, I am going to talk properly. Mm-hmm. I'm playing a Dragonborn rogue, Golden-Eyed Rakashi, who is a black dragonborn. God, try again with talking. A black dragonborn, born and raised, well, possibly not born, but raised in the city of Greyhawk as part of a crime family. She's always been something between a protege and a pet, and has all sorts of skills related to sneaking and murdering. Do we want to go into skills at this point?
Probably not as deep as skills, but if there's anything else you want to say about, her, I mean, you've sort of said a fair amount about her specialties, but if there's anything else in terms of the background of the character you wanted to give.
I mean, at the time that we're starting, the whole sort of balance of power in the criminal underworld has gone south for her. Her crime family has completely collapsed, and she ended up taking the fall for a lot of it and spending several years in prison. The number of years sort of depends on how things fall out when we start, and is now generally just embittered and hateful of everybody.
All right, so a person with a criminal past, but sort of cut off from any immediate criminal network. I tend to be the only one who actually did any time for it.
Yes.
All right. And Jeff, could you introduce your character?
Sure. So I'm going to be playing a guy by the name of Sir Simeon. He hails from the far west, kind of in a very like the only populated town in the dry steppes called Canik. So just to fill everybody else in, this is in the region that probably equates to something like Kazakhstan or northern Iran in our modern understanding of geography. So he started his adventuring career as a palace guard, and life kind of changed for him after he met a woman by the name of, trying to figure this out, Callista. And it was a short little relationship. It didn't last too long. And he, stopped thinking about her after they went their separate ways, and time passed. But then eventually she started showing up in his dreams. At first it was difficult to tell why she was there, but her presence became more and more insistent as the nights went on. And she would not stop visiting him over and over and over in the night. And eventually he took this as a sign from the god Pelor, because at the time he was a follower of Al-Akbar. But he basically became a traveler at that point.
wandering across the world trying to find her, trying to find Callista, because it sure seemed like she needed help. And she wouldn't stop visiting him. Whenever he was on the road, the messages would kind of stop or go silent or become less dire. But whenever he tarried too long in any one given place, they would start back up again. So he's kind of been all across the West. He's worked his way through to the actual area of Greyhawk. And that's how he ended up over there. He's constantly searching, trying to find her again, because he's not quite sure where to look. So he's kind of a gatherer of knowledge. He tries to kind of unlock the secrets of anything that he can find, just that maybe something would have a clue to where she might be. He's moved himself from being just a kind of standard fighter to being a sword mage. And that's his primary class right now, just because of all of the things that he's come across, all the secrets that he's unlocked during his current travels. And that's kind of the long story, I guess, there.
Great. And do you want to say anything about his sword?
I wasn't sure if I should, but it is a blue sword. It glows a... hang on, I'm trying to find the description of it. It's a blue metal, made of a blue metal that appears slightly backlit. It's symmetrical but unusually wide. You'd probably describe it as a bastard sword. When he wields it, using his sword mage technique, swirls of black dance across the sword. It's got a strong presence. Whenever he pulls it out, the whole kind of area feels different, even if you're not looking directly at it. It's got a weight to it that makes itself known, even when you're not facing it. You can tell something in the environment has changed. It also is what taught him to be a sword mage. He discovered kind of unlocking the secrets through this blade. And yeah.
Great. And just to make clear, Sarsimeon is our token human.
Yes, he's the token human.
We won't necessarily do this bit forever, but we've definitely done it twice now.
I think we really should commit to it.
It feels, as long as we keep taking turns, I think it'll work out.
Yeah.
Also, it might be worth noting that I'm looking at the Flaneus map right now, and there is a region that's just called Jeff. So I don't know if I want to reconsider.
Where is that?
It's in the Sheldamar Valley. I forgot about that. It's spelled Geoff.
It's spelled the wrong way.
Yeah.
Still.
It's riddled with giants, if I remember correctly.
Jeff the Giant.
Hey, Kacey, do you want to introduce yours? Latchkey?
Yeah, okay. So my character is named Latchkey, and they are we kind of used Shardmine as a template for them, but I don't know if they're sort of a individual without a species, I guess I would say at this point. So they are kind of a sort of a golem that was built by a mage or a series of mages that collected these crystal shards from 5 different magical artifacts and sort of used them as the basis to create a crystal/stone being that I think they originally hoped would do some of their bidding, but when Latchkey became sentient, basically just said, I'm not doing that, and left. And because their consciousness is sort of this aggregate of these 5 different crystal shards, they actually have 5 different consciousnesses that sort of time share this body. Although I don't know if we've entirely figured out why and when they switch. So they kind of wandered around for a while doing I'm not sure what, but eventually found their way to Greyhawk because Greyhawk is a city with a lot of strange things. So being one more strange thing kind of wasn't a problem. And it was a decent place to stay for a while and kind of figure out like what they were and what they wanted. And so they're still kind of doing that. So I sort of imagine, I think when they start adventuring, that will be the first time that they're like actively adventuring with the intent to do that. I think up to this point, they've basically just applied skills that they have found through trial and error that they have to kind of get to the next place. And they're a combination, or I guess dual class. Is that the right term? Mm-hmm. A Scion / Battle Mind.
And those are basically the most well, it combines two roles, right? It's the psionic power source being used for defender, that's the battle mind, and controller, which is the scion. And so it's sort of the two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, so they're broadly diverse, which is sort of where I always end up. I always like characters with like a broad range of crap that they can do. So that sounds about right.
Yes, very good. And I see that Josh has joined us. Hello, Josh.
Hello.
Hello, Josh.
Are you?
You're a bear donut right now.
Are you recording, Josh?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Awesome.
I'm unable to pop in briefly, but I am here.
Oh, thanks for being here. So we've just been going around talking about the characters that are going to be involved in the season 2 game. Yours is still somewhat TBD. Is there anything you want to say about your intention there?
No, not a lot. I've been trying to re-review the setting and mechanical material, and I'm like maybe halfway through the big back scroll that we have. So I remember that my concept was Warforged Sorcerer, so that's something.
Definitely.
But I was trying to actually like dig into it enough to like figure out how to use the mechanical stuff to build it. I'm not all the way through that yet.
That's fine. That's fine. We've still got some time.
That might make this a good time for us to talk about that.
Yeah, if you want to. So Warforged Sorcerer. So let's this is a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about what's going on mechanically in this game. So I said we're using 4th edition as our starting point mechanically, but it's pretty heavily hacked. And the way that it's heavily hacked, basically, is that 4th edition of D&D, which is probably the most controversial of all the various editions of Dungeons and Dragons, certainly, I think it's fair to say the one that Wizards of the Coast has run the most fervently from. The selling point that I will give you for it is that it has a very coherent and elegant rules set, at least as Dungeons and Dragons goes. Dungeons and Dragons tends to be a very high complexity role-playing game, as these things are measured. Not the very highest, but it's near the high end. And this is probably the simplest version of it that you can find that's still advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, you could go back further into like Chainmail or something that's simpler, but that's also not technically D&D. So we're using that as the baseline, and the races and classes that are present in the 3 players' handbooks, Players Handbook 1, 2, and 3, they're all in play, and plus a little bit more than that, because there are a couple from squirrely sources like the Forgotten Realms book and other Eberron. The various campaign settings all have 1 or 2 additional ones thrown in, so those are all accounted for. But other than those labels, we're departing from the system pretty significantly. So basically, instead of having one of the hallmarks of 4th edition, and something that you really liked if you liked it, and you really didn't like if you didn't like it, we're in a lot of middle opinions on this, was that everything in all the classes in 4th edition had 3 types of powers: at-will powers, encounter powers, and daily powers. And that was sort of their way of making everybody into sort of a wizard. Historically in D&D, wizards were very complicated. Most of the other classes were much, much, much more simple in terms of the range of choices that they had to make in order to play their characters. And wizards both suffered for the amount of choices they had to make, especially at lower levels, And then, especially as levels went up, as long as you were willing to deal with a lot of math and bookkeeping, they were easily the most powerful characters in the game. That's true for most of the editions, especially before third. And this was Wizards of the Coast's attempt to make everybody equally complicated and everybody, in theory, on an equal playing field in terms of their powers. And I will go so far. I will say it did not work for me. It's okay if it worked for you, but we're not going to be using it, so don't worry about it. Instead, each class has a small set of signature abilities that are much more static. They're not like use them once per game session. They're more like permanent rules about that character. And advancement, so when you start out the game and you have a class, you have that class's set of abilities. And advancement functions by gaining new abilities based on your character's connection to concepts related to the other classes. So, for instance, each class has a power source. This is something from the I didn't add this. This is already in place. Each class has a power source, right? So, for instance, sorcerer, the power source is arcane, and each class also has a role. Sorcerer, the role is striker. So when you start the game as a sorcerer, you have a connection to the striker role and the arcane power source. And as you advance, you can get new abilities from any other class that is either the arcane power source or the striker role. And as you get those new abilities and continue to advance, you might touch on new roles or power sources, right? If you use your striker access to get a ability from the rogue class, well, the rogue class has the martial power source. So now you're touching on them.
Kind of chain it out like that.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Is why I've been calling it the sphere grid. It's not identical to the sphere grid from Final Fantasy X.
You pick a direction, and then as you move in that, you get access to increasingly more things that are in that direction.
Yeah.
That's it exactly. Yes. And you can choose to spread yourself wide and take a little bit here and there, or you can be very directed about it. You can say, I've got this thing that it's going to take me 3 moves to get to that I want over here, and you can just make a beeline for it.
Makes
That's
sense.
the general idea.
That's pretty straightforward, actually.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I think once it's difficult to explain on paper, but I think 2 minutes in person and it sort of settles itself. And the only other thing to know is that in addition to your class stuff, you also have a couple of abilities that come with your race, and the races have their own origin, which is so basically class has 2 qualities: a role and a source. A race just has an origin, but the origins, some races have more origins than others, basically. So, for instance, it does a little bit of a balancing act between the the races are not completely 100% exactly balanced. So, to make up for that, some of the weirder races that have kind of more obscure and specific abilities have more origins. They have 2 or 3 instead of 1. It just means they have more options to start with. They're connected to more different other races, and they have more growth, more different directions they can go in at the start as they grow.
Because as we maybe not explicitly laid out, you can also take abilities from other races as you advance.
Yes. Basically, you're getting a new ability each time, roughly 1 new ability every time you go up in level. Slightly different than that, but that's basically the progression. And so keeping track of your origins, roles, and sources that you have access to is keeping track of how you can grow and develop the character. And the only other thing to say about that is that there's one really weird corner case class, which is that in 4th edition, they had often one of the squirrely source books, a class for vampire. And the vampire doesn't have a power source. They have an origin. So there's this weird way that loops around in exactly one corner case.
Is this a thing where they decided that it had to be a class because they got rid of the templates or whatever they were called from 3rd edition, but they still wanted a way that it wouldn't be a race because you could be a vampire of any race? Something like that?
That's about right. Yes, that is about right.
But you should be able to. Well,
Yeah.
I'm not going to dive too far down the rabbit hole here.
Yes.
Undead or taxonomist's nightmare.
After we
no
kill
matter
Hitler,
what.
we'll go have an argument with the people who wrote
Yeah.
Edition.
Mhm.
Yeah. Can I just say that, like, this whole process takes the thing I like least about 4th edition, which is the notion that every class has a role that you're supposed to fit into, and just uses that to make things much more diverse rather than less diverse in terms of how you build a character. And I love it, and it's great.
I really appreciate your support on this.
Yeah.
Ben.
I am the person who is most anti 4th edition, and like this totally loops it around for me and is very nice.
Yeah, the problem with role was never really the idea that like these party roles get defined, because those things all already existed. It's that the way that was implemented was incredibly narrow. You know, like it. You know, the idea that you want to have a healer and, like, you know, a DPS person, like that didn't start just because World of Warcraft came out. But.
And I mean, part of it may not be totally obvious, but part of this is that you don't have to, you can be as much in your role or out of your role as you want to be, right? Mm-hmm. You can decide, okay, I want to be really focused on being a healer, say. There's a million there's like, once you start out as a cleric, for instance, since we will have a cleric in the party, you've got 7 or 8 other healing abilities that clerics don't have that you can go out there and get in the chain. And you have access to them at the beginning because they're all leader abilities. Cleric has a leader role. You can go out and get them and focus on that. You could spend 10 levels just doing things focused on being a better healer, if that's really what you want to do. Or you could go off and focus on things like military combat, which the cleric has some ability with and has some access to stuff related to that. You could go focus on that. You can be exactly as focused on fulfilling your role as you want to be, and you can figure out the way you want to fulfill your role in order to do that. Mm-hmm. Strikers are very good at hitting hard, like doing large amounts of damage in a single shot. That's part of the focus of the striker role. But there are other abilities that are not striker abilities that you could still use that very effectively with. So you can both branch out in order to be better at your original role, and you can stay focused within your role in order to be more diverse. There's just a lot of flexibility here. Mm-hmm. What was I going to say? Something striker role thing. Yeah, it's gone. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is going to be more of a thing to pay attention to as we play than it matters in initial character design, but it's just something to keep in mind, is that because we have eliminated the encounter and daily powers, and although there are some ways in which the starting characters are just a little bit more powerful than you would have for a character of equivalent level in a standard 4th edition game. We're using, for instance, the low magic rules, which means that instead of having to collect a certain number of magical items each level to make sure that you're on par with the progression of monsters, you just get bonus points to attack and damage to make sure that you keep up with monster progression. You don't need magical items in order to take care of that for you. There are definitely some... There are artifacts. Basically, this is a setting that has artifacts but not magical items, which is a distinction that D&D makes, which I've never particularly liked. So there are a few really important things that are magical in the setting, instead of millions and millions of what amounts to hotshot equipment.
Rings of +1 around. Chewing.
Exactly, yeah. Yes. That stuff doesn't have to be in the setting anymore. So there are ways in which you're getting a leg up that way, but you don't have any encounter or daily powers, which is most of what was, that was most of the strength of a character in 4th edition. So to make up for that, we have instead what I'm calling a stunt system, and that's drawing the terminology and the basic idea from something from the Exalted games. And essentially what it is describe your character doing something really cool, and the cooler it is, the more likely it is to be effective and the more interesting bells and whistles you get to put on the power, to put on the use of your abilities. So if you get a good enough description, you go to a table and you get a certain amount of bonus points. You go to the table, you consult it, and you can add things like adding more damage or inflicting a negative status effect on an enemy, or getting a special move to use a healing effect on an ally. Basically, it's just a way to customize your character's action in order to get a new and better effect. And all of this, and similarly, this is something I know we've talked about before, Vin, so I want to talk about it now, and I want to both give you space to talk about your concerns about it, and I'll talk about how I'm going to try and mitigate them. All of this is very elastic in its relationship to between crunch and fluff, right? Here I'm using crunch as a word for the mechanics of the game, and fluff as a word for kind of the flavor and the story within the mechanics that moves around in between and within the mechanics of the game. So the mechanics are very broad intentionally. So when my character, say, starts out as a martial type, the martial type essentially is that's the catch-all for the I don't have magic type, right? And then he goes and gets a power that's attached to an ability that's attached to a class with the arcane power source, say, right? One of the magical classes. It's up to me to explain how his power works without being magic. And I'll say as the DM here, I'm going to give the person who's having to make that explanation, I'm going to give them as much leeway as I possibly can, because I want everything to work. But it's sort of a matter of making things work logically after the fact. The mechanics have allowed us to get to this point, and it'll be interesting mechanically if it happens. Now we have to figure out an explanation for how that works in character, in game, within the rules of the setting. And I'm going to say, I'm going to give you leeway, but also it is on you to come up with that explanation.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot. I like this whole system because I feel like one of the issues I've always had with D&D is that there is always sort of this disconnect between the story and then the mechanics of the story. So, you get all these items, but all these items really are mostly just to augment, your character sheet, and they don't necessarily have a reason. And I mean, maybe this is also how, just the way I experienced D&D and how it was played when I played it. But I feel like it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of getting very focused on like specific mechanics at the cost of paying less attention to the story. And I like the way that the mechanics in the story here are fairly synergistic.
That's certainly the goal. We're going to see in the course of play how well it works in practice. But definitely my interest here is because I know the people I'm working with, and I know that you're capable of telling an excellent story and breathing life into very vivid and fascinating characters, is to be in your way as little as possible. Right? The only times I want to get in your way is when there's a real problem for you to solve that's interesting narratively for you to have to solve it, rather than for me to hold you up on being like, let's look at paragraph 3 on page 85 and have an argument about whether or not that bonus applies in the situation. Yeah. Okay. That covers most of the baseline stuff I wanted to cover. Josh, do you have time to have a chat about your character now?
Briefly.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about the idea that, we're using Greyhawk as the default here, but almost everything from the other splats and source books and settings in 4th edition is fair game, and so Warforged was definitely on that list. And in fact, specifically, I had an idea for where they would be coming from in this setting.
Right. We talked about this a little bit. We were saying that, we wanted to change the name since that's very specific to the kind of Eberron background on that. I think we talked about like relic folk.
I think that was one of the ideas I threw out there. Yeah.
I personally found evocative, so I was on board with that.
Cool.
And in terms of kind of the shape that I had on this, so as I kind of went back and forth on it, I did decide that kind of sorcerer was the kind of area that I wanted to go into as a starting point, both for the idea of like specifically like the arcane magic, and also like the specific kind of aesthetic, like mechanical bent that has, at least in third edition, where it's like, you have a more limited set of things, but you can do them more often. Now, I know that that's not really exactly how that's reflected in the fourth edition rules, but it's not going to play out like that anyway, so that's fine. But that's kind of where the core of that is coming from, right? Like the idea that, and I'm kind of imagining it not so much as like a mystery in that sense, where like you have something that's like, oh, what, like how did this all happen? But more so just that like probably, at least in my mind, like each of the like constructs from this species probably has like some kind of somewhat idiosyncratic set of abilities that aren't necessarily that are probably distinct for each of them, and the exact relationship of those to each other is maybe not obvious or really consistent, if that makes sense. That
sure.
Like that kind of gives a little bit of wiggle room in terms of what it actually is, and gives a little opportunity to add stuff into the list that is maybe like not as like optimized towards a specific purpose, which is just a character building like flexibility I like to have access to.
So it sounds like the what's attractive about the sorcerer class is basically, it seems like it jives with your idea that this is a character who has some innate kind of weird power within themselves that maybe is not fully understood or fully controlled. Is that fair?
Yep.
Yeah, that works perfectly. I mean, that's a sorcerer, right? That's like, especially a fourth edition sorcerer. They have a lot of chaos mage in them. That's very, very good fit.
And I feel like that fits well with the mechanical basis, because it makes it if I start from that point and then I think probably kind of focus on arcane specifically as the source to kind of spread out powers from, it gives me access to kind of grow in a variety of different ways that spring off of that, but still all very much support that initial kind of like high concept. So that's kind of how I see that. Like I think the character concept is really well supported by this structure. So
definitely
the basically the only other thing that I'd come up with this, a lot of the time when you have these these kind of like fantasy or sci-fi stories where there's like somebody from like a weird ancient race or like robots or something, a lot of the time there's kind of this thing about like being very unique or isolated, or like I hope I can find somebody else like this, and I wanted to try to steer away from that a little bit. So again, and I think I was a little inspired like aesthetically again by the kind of name that we settled on, but I like the idea that there's not a lot of these, and maybe like all the details of where they came from and everything aren't that well understood, but that they are at least in sort of a smaller geographic region nearby wherever they kind of first got uncovered or whatever. There's something that's like known and like exists in society as a rare but like thing that people have heard, and that maybe there's kind of like kind of like almost a mail system and like club network, like a lot of people who kind of know each other a little bit in a distant sense, and like people that you can call up and hit up if there's another one in like the town that you're going to or something.
So an idea that basically like everybody knows each other even if they don't even know each other.
Right.
Okay.
Like kind of a certain sense of like kind of a diaspora like culture, in that like if you are a relic folk, like you're not going to go to a town where there's a ton of different people. You're not going to settle down in a place where it's just, this is where we all live, and like, we don't deal with anybody else. You're going to places that are mostly dominated by some other cultural or racial like kind of, model. But there's some guys there that you can hit up And even if you haven't met them specifically, like, you all kind of know that this is the slot that you're in, or the role that you fulfill in society. So you have an automatic in, kind of, that you wouldn't if you were kind of more of a majoritarian, like, fleshy person.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I think that works well. It's not going to be at all a secret in game, so I'll sort of tell you my intent here. So I mentioned this before you got on the line, Josh. The Greyhawk setting, the Flaneus, which is the main part of this, like the default campaign setting, which is sort of Europe, is part of a larger supercontinent called Auric on the planet of Orth. And there is canonically, or at least semi-canonically, there's a smallish continent way to the south of the Flaneus that's like this mystery continent and they're actually, if you want to get deep into the canon, there's like a fifth. I talk about how the Flaneus is built out of several different people's campaign worlds. There's actually somebody else's campaign world that was supposed to be that continent, and it's only dimly canonical whether their campaign world was like a weird mix of sword and sorcery and future tech. And anyways, there's an explanation for what's supposed to be happening on that continent. It's not clear if it's supposed to be canonical or not. Anyway, there's not good maps for that continent. The canon surrounding it is questionable and didn't seem that interesting to me. So I'm just cut and pasting the continent of Zendrick, which is one of the minor continents from Eberron, and plopping it there, which is basically like Jungle Australia is the synopsis for what that continent is like. It's full of weird, creepy, pre-human ruins, and got a lot of interesting things going on. But so that's what we're doing. I'm just taking an element from another campaign setting and putting it there because it's a nice map and it's got some interesting plot hooks associated with it. So all of the relic folk are going to come from there, and there's going to be a certain number of them. You and I can work out, if you want to get into specifics, exactly how many in the Flaneus itself right now, but they're all recent arrivals from this only recently sort of rediscovered continent to the south of the Flaneus. And I think that idea that they all know each other, or know someone who knows each other, works out very well then.
Yeah, and then, like, there'd probably be some that I would know, and then there's some where it's like, oh, they went on a different boat, and maybe I didn't know them beforehand, but, like, I know, like, I mean, not their cousin, I guess, but, like, maybe, like, the guy that, like, they were in a band with, or whatever.
Right.
And that kind of level. So, now, when you say recently, do you mean, like, how does that align with, like, a human lifespan and a relic folk lifespan, I guess?
I'm going to say within one of both. So not so recently enough that there are still people, human and relic folk, living who remember before this encounter happened.
So if we called it like 30 years or something like that, that would
I think 30 is a perfectly good number.
Cool. I can work with that.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from a background standpoint, that mostly kind of covers it. I got to come up with a name and, like, maybe a 3-sentence personality, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that mostly covers the broad strokes of it.
Wonderful. And I think, so we can maybe talk a little bit, and Josh, you can be involved in this if you still have time, about connections between characters. I know that, unfortunately, Braden can't be on the call this time, but Vin, you and he had already worked out that you were like roommates, right? Your characters were roommates?
No, Kacey and I are roommates.
Oh, Kacey. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I misunderstood. I misremembered, I guess. Okay, so Latchkey and
Rikashi.
Rikashi are roommates. Tell us about that relationship.
Yeah, so I was thinking that maybe Latchkey kind of showed up in Greyhawk sort of around the time that Rikashi got ousted or got out of what if she
got out of prison. Yeah.
So, like, basically they both were in this space at the same time without much, and they were both weird enough that it was convenient to have, well, first of all, they needed a roommate because rent is probably pretty high in Greyhawk. It's a city, I don't know. But also just like they were weird enough that it would be advantageous to have someone living with them that was equally weird rather than trying to like accommodate like a human.
Yeah, well, I think part of what we come up with was that we're both staying at a place that's kind of amenable specifically to people in weird situations.
Yeah.
Which is this inn that also connects back to Braden's character, which is maybe where you got that from.
That's it, yes.
And Rakashi is there because she still has enough like debts and connections to call in from her old role that she can wrangle herself a spot there. And then Latchkey ends up there essentially because it's a place where she can go.
Right.
Where they can go. And so we sort of share a basement suite and occasionally have to host whatever other weirdo is passing through.
Right.
All right. We're going to need to, as a group, to remember that Latchkey's pronouns are they, them, theirs.
Yes.
Yep.
Cool. Yes, and that you're right, Ben. That was my confusion. I was remembering that it's essentially Braden's character's inn, or the inn to which Braden's character is deeply connected, that you're staying in, which I think provides some pretty good opportunity for a connection to Sarsimian. Don't you think, Jeff?
Yeah, that was actually something that me and Braden had talked about before. Because I think we are both now followers of Rao, I believe. Oh,
right. So Sarsimian is converted to the Raoist faith, and Braden's character is technically Raoist, although in sort of a weird subsection of the faith. Yes.
Right. And I think that because Sarsimian is a traveler, and he kind of is always seeking, always trying to figure out something. And that way stop that Braden's character runs is a place he'd probably stayed several times. Like Sarsimian and Braden have definitely had beer together, probably multiple times as he's crossed his way through and round and over the hill and dale. So I definitely picture it as a place where if he's around, if he's in that part of town, that's the first stop he makes.
So is it possible that Latchkey and Rakeshi have actually hosted him a time or two?
It's definitely possible, depending on how long, like, the interval has been since he's moved and when you guys moved in. So it's definitely possible that we were all hanging out in the bar together. Especially if you... Is it Wenta? I can't remember what Braden's character's name is.
Wenta, yes.
Wenta is the goddess. Braden's character is Balmo.
Yes.
Balmo, okay.
Wenta is the goddess of ale and technically the exarch of... I think we said that she was the exarch of Avandra, if I remember correctly. So the exarch of the goddess of change, travel, and luck, and her purview is ale and hospitality.
So the beer is usually pretty good.
That's the idea.
It has to be good.
Otherwise, it's sacrilege.
And Josh, I don't know if there's an obvious place for your character to fit into all of this, but Travelers at an Inn, it is a classic beginning.
Yeah, I kind of lean towards... I feel like my role, and again, this is kind of like the thing that you wind up in when you're, kind of moved into a different culture with only a very tenuous kind of connection out to the other people that share yours. But I imagine that he's kind of in business for himself somewhere. My guess would be that he kind of found a town that he liked, and he set up kind of offering minor arcane services, of some manner or another. And we could kind of tweak that to what is most likely to actually interact with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of seems like the end to me, is that like somebody has to, somebody is like actually a customer. and then we leverage that in some way to actually connect into the party proper.
Okay.
Either he could, depending on what what are you kind of thinking is the kind of purpose of the group, right? Because is there going to be a specific inciting incident, do you think, or is there going to be kind of a pre-existing relationship, if that makes sense?
So actually my intent is that there are 5 different reasons for each of you to work together. That there's an element tied to each of the characters' backstories that draws them in a very specific direction simultaneously. And it's pretty natural that you should at least collaborate as far as traveling goes.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a good answer for that for at least Sarsimian, Balmo, and Latchkey. I can think offhand of a pretty good answer for your character, Josh, at least as far as we know about them. I'm still working a little bit on Ratashi, but I think that's pretty solvable. So it's mostly just having everybody in the same place when they realize that they have the same interest. So I think even just as simple as having your character set up shop at the inn, as an office, basically will work.
Look, I figured that he was somebody that they had, with geographic proximity, not because, or that knows them because of geographic proximity, not the other way around. He operates in a space that's right near where they're situated,
right across the street.
Right. So I'm kind of imagining if me and the video game enthusiast at the corner store who I talk to when I go to get beer, found out that we had the same mystical quest. It would be convenient because we're both right there. So yes,
that would probably also be a show on Hulu.
Yeah. Actually, now that I think about it, if you had a trinket shop, right, and it's a sundries or something that's all arcane related, anytime that Sarsimian left the inn, that would be the first place he'd go to check out to see if you had anything new that you didn't necessarily know what you had, kind of thing. He'd always be checking out pawn shops.
Oh yeah, that sounds pretty perfect.
Of that type.
Yeah, and so we could even have kind of an ongoing rapport with that. And...
yeah, hey, got anything new today? And then he just checks out and touches absolutely everything that you have.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah, I like that.
Nice.
Yeah, I think that sets us up pretty well. Once we have a call that has Braden on it, we should be sort of ready to go there. That's really good. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts, concerns, things they want to square away before we get started? This is a good time to address them.
If anybody does, I'm going to drop off now.
Sure.
But, I'll follow up with more details on this now that we kind of talked it out a little.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Bye-bye.
Proto character. I kind of had a question. It's very my character specific though, so I don't know if necessarily we can hit on it post recording too. But I had talked with you about so Latchkey doesn't really eat or sleep or breathe or anything, but I was thinking that because they're psionic and because of sort of the nature of what they are, that it might make sense if they actually needed some kind of sustenance from kind of just the psychic ambience of people, or
they need to be around people.
Yeah, they need to. I mean, it also explains why something that doesn't really need any kind of you don't need people to survive, and you don't necessarily if they're trying to figure themselves out and the first 2 people they encountered were why would they seek out a large city in the first place? I think that kind of touches on that, and also probably the artifacts that they came from, because they were all used by sentient species in various locations. There's probably some pull towards just interacting with them again. But I guess my question was that works fine in a big city setting where it's just like, okay, well, they need this much psychic energy or whatever per day, and you just sort of skim a minuscule amount off of the large group of people that are around. It becomes more problematic when you're with a group of like 5 people and that's all you have.
How about this? This is what comes to mind for me. I think the biggest thing is the need for making a parallel to the need for, like, bigger than the need for food is the need for sleep, because that's the biggest thing that has an impact on the way that a character behaves relative to the rest of the party.
Sure.
If one character doesn't need sleep and everybody else does, that's really different. That they need to essentially meditate in very close proximity to a sleeping humanoid. Right? There's something.
Wow, that's so weird.
That's really good.
And my thought is that's something like a defrag for them. Right? It's not that it's like exactly life or death in the way that, say, eating would be. Right? If I don't eat, I die.
Right.
But that there's something about the way that, especially the multiple personalities interact, that goes really bad if they don't get their meditation time in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me, actually, because if they're sort of structuring a personality by the seat of their pants, then like having a template that they can use, that they need to constantly refresh, like seems like it would be profoundly helpful. And if they start to not have that, then like things go south.
And at start of play, they're in a situation where they have a roommate, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of already set up. So I think that works for you. I think that's what we'll go with.
Yeah, I like that. I think that works really well.
Good.
So Kelly, when we're doing stunts, how would you prefer us to like go at it? Like, should we just kind of do stunts as the circumstances demanded, or should we look at this table and try to figure out like what we want to be a part of our stunts and like base it off of that?
So I think it's going to vary a lot by character. Here's my example, right? With something like a wizard, most of the time the stunt is going to be, I cast Hercule's quarter monster, right? And that's what that spell does, this thing, and I'm going to describe what the spell does. And I have an idea, because I have a sense of the chart in my head, of what I'm like. It's a damaging effect, and maybe it has some kind of a status effect that it's going to inflict. You know, there's actually a thing in one of the class abilities that essentially lets you turn an attack into a summon. So maybe it has that quality to it.
Okay.
So for certain classes, that's going to be really obvious, right? The stunt is coming up with an interesting title for the literal thing you're doing, and an interesting set of visual and auditory effects, right? For like a fighter, that's pretty different.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing that shit just on the fly all the time, I think.
That's more like you describe a cool-ass combat move. Right.
Kind of more how I do Exalted generally, rather than like, yeah.
In Exalted, you don't have a lot of choices to make, right? That's the difference. The Exalted stuff system
I get
like
1 die, 2 die, 3 die. I get some notes back, and it's kind of the same every time.
But here you don't have to make a lot of choices, because you can just be like, I just want to put my stunts into damage. I mean, you can always just put your stunts into damage. True. So if you're just doing combat moves, that's pretty straightforward. Sir Simeon is an interesting in-between place where he is basically both a fighter and a wizard, right? He's going to be doing a bunch of flashy sword stunts because he's a sword guy, right? But also sometimes his sword spits acid, and like that's the idea behind the sword mage, is that they're like routinely throwing off cool elemental effects with their sword blows. So it's an interesting combination of you can kind of have it both ways there. You can just describe cool sword guy moves, and you can also say, and this is Vladimir's cool sword guy move of the 10th illustration, right? And then I draw a sigil in the air with my sword. You've kind of got both options.
Okay. Okay, cool.
And again, you should feel free to have an angle worked out on the table already. But if you don't, it's not the end of the world. Just know that we'd prefer not to wait for a million years for you to figure out what you're going to get on the table. Yeah. If you look at... It's a good idea maybe to sit down with your character sheet and the table, because a lot of what the tables actually include is things like, if you already have this effect, then you can go here, right? If you already can stun somebody, stun's a pretty good status effect, but with just one more, I think it's just one more step on the table, you can get to dazed. Dazed is a really good status effect.
Right.
So basically, like, if you start out already doing a status effect, you can push it real far with the stunt. Whereas if you start from 0, my attack doesn't inflict a status effect and I want to start doing that, it just takes more steps to get there.
Right.
Cool. Anybody else?
I think I'm mostly covered.
Yeah, you've been... As always, Vin, you're my early adopter.
I'm excited to play. I can't wait.
I'm really looking forward to it.
I've only done Aberrant with you, so it's going to be cool to do something different.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to exploring a whole new genre for most of us. We haven't, I mean, as much as we've gamed together, we haven't done a lot of fantasy gaming together.
Yep.
So that's going to be cool.
Yeah.
All right. I think that covers what I have to cover. So thank you all for a productive and enjoyable conversation. We'll talk more about this soon. We don't have an exact timetable for when we're starting season 2, but it's clearly going to be soon because we're almost done with season 1.
Yeah,
that is true.
Yep. Right on.
Thanks for listening,
All right.
everyone.
Thanks,
Awesome,
everybody.
guys.
Yay.
Until
Bye.
next time.
Until next time. Yes. Enjoy the now more thematically appropriate theme music.
Oh, wait. I got a question.
Oh, yeah.
So how's the Chimera going to get integrated into this one?
Ah, yes. Well, you will see.
Okay.
I'm starting to get a little worried that I'm going to have to cram too much stuff into the first game. I hope we have enough time for it, but my goal is that by the end of the first game, several of the questions like that will have been answered with a certain amount of oh no.
Awesome.
I might want to take a moment to clarify for the listeners that early on we decided that whatever game we're playing for a season of the show, the concept of a or the Chimera would be present as a thing. So for the first season, we decided it was going to be the name of the ship. And for the second season, it is now a sword of Damocles.
Basically, yes.
Yeah, 3-edged sword.
All right, everybody. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
That's it this week for the Chimera. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the continuation of the final arc of Season 1, and we may also drop in a mini episode about Brayden's Season 2 character, Belmo Barleywain, the Halfling Cleric. Until then, you can find us online at thechimera.space or on Twitter and Facebook at ChimeraPod. And if you get a minute, please do stop by your preferred podcast venue, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or any place else that you can do this stuff on, and leave us a rating and a review. All your feedback is greatly appreciated and helps point new listeners in our direction. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.